You're listening to a Frequency Podcast Network production in association with CityNews.
By the end of January, just over half of Canadian kids aged 5 to 11 had received their first dose of the COVID vaccine during the 2 months since its approval. That number is creeping up slowly, but it's still nowhere near the 72% of kids aged 12 to 17 who got theirs in the first 2 months. It's fair to ask what the difference is between those groups. To a certain extent, parents are warier of vaccinating younger children, no matter how safe it may be. As well, this is an age group that generally handles COVID well, so the individual decisions made by parents might outweigh those made for the greater good. But if you want to try and wrap your head around the outlook that leads to parents making that choice, it's more important to ask where the difference is rather than what. One reporter did just that recently in Canada's largest city. The results paint an interesting picture. If you want to know which kids are likely to be unvaccinated, there's a decent way to tell. They're the ones attending alternative schools. Even before COVID, with vaccines that had been proven safe over decades, the opt-out rate among alternative school kids was many, many times higher than kids in traditional classrooms. So why is that? Where does that vaccine hesitancy come from? And what can we learn about the factors parents weigh when they make those decisions by studying the philosophies of the schools chosen by parents who don't vaccinate their kids? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Inori Roy is a freelance investigative journalist based in Toronto. Her work has appeared in the Toronto Star, the Narwhal, and for this project, in The Local. Hey, Inori.
Hi, Jordan. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. For the purposes of this conversation, why don't we just start by having you define or describe what we mean when we talk about alternative schools? What are they?
Yeah, so alternative schools, and for the purposes of this story, are schools within the Toronto District Public School, board, so they are publicly funded, but they provide alternatives to mainstream education. So they're usually much smaller in terms of class sizes and in terms of size of the school overall, and they usually have particular themes related to them. So because they're providing alternatives to the mainstream, they'll instead have themes like being based on outdoor education or community involvement, the arts, social justice, or particular styles of teaching, like the Waldorf-inspired schools. One thing I wanted to note that was quite interesting that came up in the research for this piece is that amongst the elementary schools, the alternative elementary schools in Toronto, there is a sense of them being more elite amongst researchers and a sense that parents sort of strive to put their kids in those schools and then in the secondary system send them off to private schools. But alternative secondary schools are not considered particularly elite. Instead, they're usually for kids who aren't really thriving in the mainstream secondary school system. So there's quite a difference between who is seen as attending elementary alternative schools and secondary alternative schools.
That's really interesting. How many of these schools exist in the TDSB?
There are around 40.
Okay. So a substantial number, and these they're attended by a smaller number of children. And I know this, because you'll probably hear me mention that my own mother ran an alternative school for 25 years. It was a grade 7-8, so middle school, but very much that, parents really trying to get in, application process, et cetera, what you'd consider, I guess, an elite atmosphere, even though the kids were from all walks of life.
Exactly. That's right. They are open to the public and anyone can apply. But there has been a question amongst, people who are trying to advocate for more equitable alternative school systems that depending on where you are in the city, sometimes you end up with, communities in the schools that aren't particularly diverse, that are from the same sort of economic, like upper middle class or upper class backgrounds. And so while they are available to everyone, there is a sense of exclusivity to them.
And what fascinates me about your work on this story is we're going to talk about vaccination rates in these schools in pre-COVID times. So this is not actually talking about the COVID vaccine. So give us an idea of what those rates are, how many people opt out, and then in a second we can talk about what opting out actually means.
Yeah, sure. So the exemption rates for alternative schools For alternative elementary schools, it's about 13% exemption rate. For high schools, it's 4%. So you'll see that's quite a bit lower. So overall, it's around an 8% exemption rate from mandatory vaccines. So for the data that's provided by the city, that is calculated mainly for the DPT vaccine and for MMR, so measles, mumps, rubella. And so overall, you'll see like a nearly 5 times higher than non-alternative vaccination rates, because non-alternative vaccination rates are around 1.8%. So it's a pretty stark difference, especially at the elementary level.
What exactly is the exemption that we're talking about here, and what does it entail? How do you get it?
Yeah, so this is a non-medical exemption. So medical exemptions, the process is sort of standard and across the board, and it involves, having your doctor sort of give you a note for it. Non-medical exemptions are conscientious, philosophical, or religious exemptions. They go by a few different names. And the process is that anyone can apply for a non-medical exemption. It involves filling out a form, and then the parents have to go to an education session. They have to watch a 30-minute standard video that is provided publicly and is available to anyone who would like to access it. And then once you've sort of done that education session, watch that video, you just sort of fill out the necessary paperwork, and then you're given your exemption.
This is probably a question that's going to sound controversial. I don't mean to try to stir anything up either way, but if these vaccines are quote unquote mandatory and these exemptions are not for medical reasons, why does the board allow it?
I think there are a lot of complex legal factors behind it that, for someone who's not a legal expert, probably wouldn't be able to get into the details of. But I know that there is a sense that the non-medical exemptions are sort of fundamental to like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's one of the ideas that has been put forward by researchers who've involved themselves in understanding the history of non-medical exemptions. There's also, as I mentioned in the article, there is a sort of complex history of parents advocating for it. And so there's a sense that at this point it feels a little unavoidable. And I think that there is a legal precedent, certainly, and it would be quite difficult to challenge that.
Fair enough. That's why I asked. When you speak to teachers and workers at these alternative schools, or even just people in the board who look at both alternative schools and non-alternative schools, what do they say the reasons are for that stark difference in terms of exemptions?
Well, it's interesting because there's a spectrum of hesitancy, right? So
Right.
there's sort of a small extreme minority who straight up just won't believe in biomedical science, right? They'll say that, Western medicine doesn't have our best interests at heart. It's not how we go with our kids. Like, it's not the route we choose to take. And so instead, we're going to focus on different forms of medicine. So homeopathic medicine or other forms of medicine that aren't super common. But that spectrum, sort of can move from that extreme to a more general distrust, for example, in pharmaceutical companies. It's interesting because in a lot of ways, these are the two halves of parents who are really engaged with the question of like community and social justice. I find that on the one hand, when you think about social justice, you have to think about, common good and making decisions that help the common good, include getting vaccine. But on the other hand, parents who are very engaged with social issues also understand that, there is a reason to potentially distrust major pharmaceutical companies who have had a history of doing things that can harm potentially marginalized people. And so there is a sense that, amongst a middle group of those parents, there is that distrust in pharmaceutical companies. And then on the other end, there's parents who sort of have a pretty common perspective, which is that they've just not seen enough of an effect of the vaccine. Like, they haven't seen it, roll out over enough time to be able to tell what the long-term impacts are. And so they will wait until they've seen that impact to be able to make their decision. So across all of these different factors, one of the common things that you see is there is a belief that their knowledge networks and their ability to do their own research and gain their own understanding of the situation is equal to that of science. And so, with all due respect, of course, the ability of a person who is not a scientist, who is not involved in, peer-reviewed scientific research and, the sort of massively funded, globally initiated research that's happened into these vaccines, obviously that's not going to be able to, mirror an individual parent or a group of parents in a small city who don't have their own sort of resources on this subject. And so you'll find that despite those differences, despite that imbalance in like scientific experts certainly being able to speak for the vaccine and parents doing their own research not being able to, those parents will think their research is equal and is up to par.
Okay, well, we'll give that to them for now. In terms of the schools themselves, this is something else that I found interesting. Is there anything that some of them have in common that lends itself to the approach that you just mentioned? For instance, I think right when we started, you mentioned the Waldorf learning philosophy. What is that, and how might it play into what we're talking about here?
Yeah, so the Waldorf learning philosophy is the thing that's quite tricky about it is that there is no body that like speaks for Waldorf across the world.
Okay.
There are Waldorf schools all over the planet, and they all sort of have their different approaches that are informed by a few overarching factors that remain common. And so those factors are that Waldorf learning believes that the mainstream and traditional approaches to teaching aren't working for kids. Specifically, that they're too prescriptive and that the sort of benchmarks and standards that they set up for children don't really match the children's sort of natural and intuitive abilities. And so Waldorf learning combines some amount of academic learning with also a lot of sort of hands-on activities and emotional learning, things of that nature. So they have a sort of motto of like heart, head, and hands. And so there's a lot of doing involved in Waldorf learning, and there's a sort of emphasis on the arts, on being in nature, and on setting up different academic benchmarks, perhaps ones that are a little less strenuous than what they perceive the mainstream system to be.
I think so far when we've talked about alternative schools, especially in the Waldorf style, we're talking about those schools that we mentioned at the beginning that are predominantly elementary and are kind of seen as elite. But what about other schools that serve different communities? What are they like? And I guess what's the same and what's different about their philosophies towards vaccines? And I guess I'm speaking about the parents, but the schools as well.
Mhm. So one of the schools that we spotlighted in this story that I think really illustrates that is the Afrocentric school. So that is an environment where the learning is geared towards understanding Black history, Black realities, and there's a sort of an approach that really focuses in on that Afrocentric thinking. And so the difference between a school like that and a school like Da Vinci, which is a Waldorf inspired school, is that at the Afrocentric school, there is a recognition of the history and the harm that the medical community has caused to Black people over time. And so,
Mm-hmm.
of course, that goes back to, periods of enslavement and even, sort of over the last century. And so there's a different hesitation towards vaccines. The hesitation amongst Da Vinci parents is very much one of, well, I don't necessarily trust the system because the medical, the medical beliefs that I have don't align with Western medicine necessarily, or I have a distrust of pharmaceutical companies versus for Afrocentric school parents, some of them, of course, not all, it's not a monolith, but some of them have a sense of, well, there's been a history of trauma in the Black community with regards to how they've been treated by the medical community.
Right.
And there's a sense that, we'll make our own decisions as we sort of speak with healthcare providers who we know we can trust, who we know have our best interests at heart, because we don't feel that the system overall has our best interests at heart because they haven't in the past. And so there's a marginalization and a historical trauma in a school like the Afrocentric school that doesn't exist at Da Vinci. And so that is a really important distinction. And that makes, that is the distinction that sets apart the conversations that are being had at a school like the Afrocentric school. But again, it's not sort of across the board, just because parents at that school sort of have an interest in their children learning like in an Afrocentric manner. That doesn't necessarily mean they're all having the same conversations about the vaccine.
As I mentioned right at the beginning, the data we're looking at for this predates COVID. So we're not talking about the COVID vaccine here. As you mentioned, we're talking about MMR and other ones. My question, though, is about how this plays into the pandemic and in either kind of alternative school or just in alternative schools as a whole. Has that distrustful attitude towards science and the medical community, wherever it comes from, translated into suspicion of other scientific approaches to the pandemic. So, mask wearing, cohorting, even believing that COVID is real, which I also know can be a problem.
Yeah, so as we covered in the story a particular instance that happened at Da Vinci. So Da Vinci shares the school building with Lord Lansdowne, which is another public school. And so there's the mainstream school and the alternative school inside the same building. That is the case with most alternative schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the incidents that we speak about in the story is that there was an altercation between a Lord Lansdowne parent and a Da Vinci parent who were both picking up their kids from the daycare on site because the Lord Lansdowne parent asked the Da Vinci parent to put on their mask, and the Da Vinci parent sort of became very agitated and said that mask wearing isn't necessary because COVID isn't real. It's just the regular flu. Everyone's making a big deal for no reason. There's no reason for mask wearing at all. And so that was one of the altercations that really sort of illustrated to the teachers and parents on site that there was a problem here. And so that is, it's a reality amongst a minority. I'm not going to say it's that all sort of alternative school parents are anti-mask. That's not the case at all.
Right.
It is a sort of extreme minority who fall in the realm of not believing that that science can really be trusted in terms of its assessment of the pandemic. And so what you'll see more often is amongst these parents a sense that the things that my child is going through to make space for the pandemic and to take precautions against it aren't worth the psychological trauma. And so, the parents and teachers that we spoke to anonymously for this story, some of them noted that one of the key things was that parents kept believing that if their children saw people wearing masks all the time, that there would be a sense of trauma, that children can't really understand or emotionally process the world, being masked up. And so that was a reason to avoid masks and to not impose that on children, which is, something that in particular, like some teachers disagreed with. They felt that, they had seen the students adapt really well inside the classroom when their parents weren't around and they were wearing masks. And so, there's a question as to whether those parents are being fair in their assessment of what their kids are experiencing, or whether there's an overall sense of needing to protect children from something that is in fact helping them. And so that's one of the ways in which that sense of skepticism that scientists maybe are being too precautious or going too far, that is sort of impacting the way that the parents want their children to interact with the world around them.
I will just say, because it sounds like I'm being skeptical towards these folks for this entire interview, that I have a lot of empathy for every parent that worries about this stuff and the long-term damage it's doing to kids. So I totally understand where that questioning nature comes from. What I want to know is what kinds of conversations are happening between teachers and parents, between parents and parents around the uptake on COVID vaccines, which I am assuming, because it is the trend in the general public, will be much less even than the uptake for, say, the MMR vaccine.
Yeah. So first of all, definitely it's important to have empathy for parents in these situations, because without that, there's also no way to get through to them. There has to be sort of one of the first things that is important in terms of communicating with these parents is the sense of, their fears are understandable. Everyone's really worried about the impact that this is going to have on children. And so I'm not a parent myself, but I have a lot of empathy for what these parents are going through and the things they might be aware of and worrying about on a constant basis. And in terms of the conversations that are happening in the schools between parents and teachers, between parents and parents, one of the things that has proven really interesting is that amongst the parents who are more extreme and the parents who are very skeptical of the medical system and the scientific system, they will direct some of their requests around, not being as harsh with the masks, or in terms of, not feeling that this is the right time to get vaccinated. They will direct that towards the teachers, because they feel that, it's part of the teacher's responsibility to hear where parents are coming from, and it's part of the administration's responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And so that dialogue doesn't really work two ways. Like I have found with the teachers I spoke to that there isn't that much of a return dialogue between teachers and parents, where teachers are trying to convince parents that the vaccine is a viable solution. That's not really happening. Those conversations largely take place between parents and like public health authorities. And so, one of the ways in which that functions is that amongst parents, there is a potential risk of misinformation, because a set of parents will do their own research and come to specific conclusions. One of the ways that one of the researchers put it is that the parents often end up becoming fixated on the limitations of a study. So they will, engage with medical research, they will engage with scientific research that has been published and peer reviewed. But when it comes to, the part of a scientific study where they have, these are the limitations of this study, and sort of use it to define their entire understanding of the piece of research, even if, they're sort of disproportionately focusing on the limitations. And so what ends up being the case is that sometimes misinformation based on those limitations can travel from parent to parent, and spread through those means. But equally, right. Parents are able to listen to public health authorities, or even if there is a medical professional or a scientist in their midst. Like, for example, one of the parents we spoke to for this story is a clinician and researcher, and so he's had sessions with the students, and is open to parents asking him questions about the vaccine that he's able to answer with authority and with certainty. So as much as parents are prone to sharing information amongst themselves, that can also be used for good, because there are some medical professionals whose kids go to alternative schools. And so that's proven to be a really good opportunity for parents to sort of learn and have their worries about the vaccine assuaged by people who are authoritative and have the ability to speak with certainty on the matter.
I probably should have asked this earlier, but has the TDSB, either to you or to anybody else, addressed this discrepancy in alternative schools and vaccination?
So when I spoke to the TDSB for this story, they said that because they, can't speak for certainty as to vaccine uptake among alternative school students, they aren't going to roll out any specific or targeted information sessions or, ways to share information until they know what that uptake is like. With regards to existing mandatory vaccines, there hasn't been any targeted outreach that I know of. And in terms of the COVID vaccine, I believe that is, still something that they're deciding whether they'd like to do, and that's done in association with Toronto Public Health. And so I haven't heard of any targeted outreach as of yet.
This is my last question, and you might have just answered it, but just to be clear, when you say they're talking with Toronto Public Health about whether or not to do it, are you talking about adding the COVID vaccine to the list of mandatory school vaccines?
Yeah, so that is something that Toronto Public Health has wanted to do. They've requested to the province that this take place. The province is not keen to do so at this time, and so I don't believe that is something that Toronto Public Health is putting a lot of investment into, because they know it's going to be a significant uphill battle to get that agreed upon at a provincial level. And so there has been an attempt to do that. There was also an attempt to get rid of non-medical exemptions even before the pandemic started. So this was in 2019. They petitioned the province saying that the non-medical exemptions are getting a little out of hand in terms of the rate at which they're increasing. I think there was a doubling over the last decade or two. And so there was a sense that, this is a problem that we're going to have to address. And then the pandemic happened. And both times the province wasn't inclined to get rid of non-medical exemptions. And so for now, despite Toronto Public Health's best efforts, the COVID vaccine likely won't become mandatory in schools, and non-medical exemptions for other vaccines won't be eliminated. And so Toronto Public Health, I think, is focusing on ways to reach out to parents in specific schools to be able to, convince them that the vaccine is worth it and is, a safe and healthy solution. But that will depend on the uptake that we're seeing at these schools over the next, few months or year.
It'll be a really interesting thing to watch. Inori, thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Inori Roy, writing for The Local. That was The Big Story. For more from us, head to thebigstorypodcast.ca, find us on Twitter at TheBigStoryFPN, and talk to us anytime via email, thebigstorypodcast, that's all one word, at rci.rogers.com. You can also find this podcast in your favorite podcast player, Apple or Google or Stitcher or Spotify or Pocket Cast or Overcast or Good Pods or whatever you want. But when you do find it, make sure to leave a rating, leave a review, and as always, tell your friends. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.